Fantasy cities are more than a map with buildings. They're living, breathing ecosystems filled with stories, tensions, and character. But here's the catch. Building a fantasy city from scratch can be overwhelming. So where do you even start? Today on the Bearded Nerd podcast, I'm walking you through my personal step-by-step guide to designing a fantasy city. Whether you're building the political capital of an empire or a spooky little harbor town full of secrets, this method will help you create cities your players will remember and want to explore. So if you're ready to learn how to build these wonderful cities, let's dive into this episode of the Bearded Nerd podcast. As we begin to build this city, there is a concept that I would highly recommend you take into consideration, which is going to be the starting line, right? And it's going to be the city's purpose. That is where you start. Every city has a purpose for the most part. Every city exists for a reason. So you'll go and ask yourself 3 questions. Why was it founded? What resource or feature or threat drew people in to that area? And then what keeps that city alive? And what keeps that city from barely surviving, right? That is kind of the concept that you want to think about. So I'm going to give you a real world example of how you would start with the city's purpose, and it's going to be really easy. Then I'll provide you some fantasy seeds that you can plant for your game. But I lived in a city called Steubenville, Ohio. If you're unfamiliar with it, it's an interesting city. But what I would tell myself if I was trying to create a city like that in my fantasy world, I would ask myself, why was it founded? Well, the city of Steubenville was founded or developed for coal mining, steel production, paper mills, glass factories, potteries, pretty much every sort of, industrial production. It was founded for that. And the resources of coal and steel and the feature of production is what drew people in. However, because of the actual death of the steel mill, the city went from a thriving, beautiful city to a really economically deprived city when I was living there. Now, there's a lot of real world ties into that because Steubenville used to be the meeting ground for mafia that would come in from New York City and from Chicago because it was like the halfway point. So the feature of distance, of equal distance and neutral territory is something that people were drawn to in the criminal organizational world, right? These are all things that you could use in your world building. Maybe it was founded for XYZ reason, and maybe there are legitimate features and resources that draw people. But don't be afraid to add features that maybe the criminal organizations of your world would be drawn to, or the holy organizations that you have in your world. And like I promised earlier, I was going to provide those seeds. So maybe it's built around a holy relic. Maybe there's a growing war camp, right, in the area that then formed into a city. Or maybe it's carved into the cliffs, right, to avoid raiders or to provide some sort of natural protection. It could also be a trade nexus between rival nations. Again, very similar to some of the things I stated earlier, but applied in real life. So just think about the origin of your city because it tells you what kind of people live there. And then what kind of stories would belong there. that would help you to write out plot hooks for your game. Now, very similar to how I've mentioned in the past, your geography and the layout is going to be really important, okay? The terrain shapes everything. Mountain cities might have tiered layers and defensible walls, right? It's going to have that type of defense in mind. River cities are going to be open trade hubs. They are going to have the defense of river systems, sure, but there's going to be flooding concerns. The people are going to think about that and build like that. Underground cities, low ceilings, vertical transports, that type of practical layout. So when you, again, lay those things out and start to build and start to define all that, I would highly recommend that you use real world inspiration. Just like I mentioned, Steubenville, Ohio, Venice, right, for their canals, Istanbul or Constantinople, depending on how you define it, for those crossroads. Think in districts. That's another big thing that people don't often think about. It comes naturally, but people don't think about it in the sense of building a cityscape, right? Where's the merchant ward going to be? Where are the slums going to be? The docks, the noble area, all those type of districts. Again, it doesn't have to be a merchant district, a fashion district. You could go that detailed, but it has to be segmented. Districts were places where things naturally grew and segmented, right? For example, a merchant district is where the market started when the town was formed and then grew into a city. The nobles chose to live there because of some sort of practical advantage. Maybe it's uphill and it represents, their nobility or whatever, but also maybe the smell of certain things doesn't waft. It rolls down that hill. And then the slums, unfortunately, is where maybe that bad smell or air goes into. Or that's maybe where the government regulated them into, right? It just depends. You can have little details on that, but remember that you should have a district. A good city and a good city map, it will read like a story, right? There will be tension in those areas where the power is at top and the people are at the bottom. And there's maybe little secrets and little tension bits in those cracks, so to speak. Hey, y'all, if you're still listening to this episode, number one, thank you so much. I really appreciate you for listening and taking the time, because you could have taken the time to listen to something else, but you chose this podcast. So I really appreciate it. Second, a lot of folks are not subscribed to the podcast. I would love it if you can go ahead, hit that subscribe button, and let me know what you would like to hear next in the podcast and what your favorite part of this podcast was. Thank you so much, and let's get back to the episode. Now, this is going to be the bread and butter for most of y'all. This is going to be the fun part where we will build key landmarks. That's the biggest thing that draws people in, right? And what I would say is to start with like 3 to 5 iconic locations. In my homebrew world of Ecopia, I have 5 locations in the starting city of Legalheim. It's important to have this because you, as a game master, need to draw people in. So, number 1, the Laughing Mimic Inn. That's where every player starts their campaign. That is where every adventurer starts. It is that safe haven within the world. Nothing bad will happen to them there, I promise. Then the Temple District. That's the second iconic landscape, especially the Temple of the 12. That honors those gods in that pantheon in that region. And there's a lot of lore and history with it too. Number 3 is the Magic University within the city. Actually, there's a whole campaign that I've pretty much written for that university, but that's not the point. It's a place where people can learn swordplay using magic and then magical means in general. Just those three alone, I've been able to establish what I'm wanting to do, which is establishing an identity for the city. I wanted to be able to tie factions and religion and historical kind of segments into one bit. And then I wanted to create a quest hub. So each of those areas does that for me. Remember this as well. You can leave some of those landmarks mysterious and have the players discover it or find ways to kind of keep it mysterious, for lack of better words. You don't have to explain everything. That does add a cool layer of just, untouchable, that this thing is just there. Everyone has known it to be there. Like, let's say a giant boulder that's in the middle of the city. No one knows why it's in the middle of the city, but it's just become a landmark and everyone touches it or bows in front of it, something of that nature. But basically, it's revered and no one knows why it's revered almost. That could be done as well. It adds a layer of depth to your world building and your storytelling. All right, so we've talked about a couple of different things on the show so far, but the one thing that I think is going to really help you that you can do right now in any city that you're in is create 3 factions that clash. I've talked about it before, where factions bring drama. There's natural drama and tension when 3 opposing factions begin to clash. If you remember watching Game of Thrones back when it was really good, the Starks, the Lannisters, and the Tullys, or the Starks, Lannisters, Baratheons, the Starks, Lannisters, and Martells, or the Stark Bannisters and the Tyrells, right? Those 3 families always had some sort of crazy clash of sorts. And you can mix and match them, not a problem. But they always had a clash. There was some sort of drama that was brought into it. Same concept, right? You want to design 3 major factions that want different things. They use different methods to obtain those things. And then they disagree with each other. But the fun part is they can't afford a war, right? So let's say you have like the Guild of Chains and they're slave traders. And then you have, priests and religious people who are abolitionists. And then you have the silent coin who are like the secret bankers, right? Those 3 oppose each other, right? And let's say let's call these abolitionist priests the Dawnbound, something like that. So the Dawnbound priests oppose the Guild of Chains, right? They do not like what they do. The Guild of Chains does not like what they do. The Silent Coin doesn't like any of them, but will support them because they're a bank, right? They are a bank of like criminals and whatnot. So maybe they have secret ties to both and they're just kind of neutral about it. But again, they all clash with one another. And then let the players tip the balance, right? If you're like my players, or if you have players like mine, they're most likely going to support the Dawnbound. And they're going to cannibalize and destroy the Guild of Chains. And then after that's done, they're probably going to try to wheel and deal with the Silent Coin. I don't know. I have some kind of crazy players and I love them, but they would definitely side with one of the actual factions, right? So factions are like levers. You gotta let the players pull them and leverage them. But number 5, and I think this part is really important because again, you could do this right now, just like what I just mentioned with the factions. Number 5 is adding flavor through the culture and quirks, right? It's okay, and I actually highly recommend that you flavor, no pun intended, your town or city with certain quote-unquote ingredients, local slang or curse words, right? So if you remember, in I think it was Battlestar Galactica, they would use frack instead of the F word. So using something like that brought a lot of identity to it. You can add in superstitions or customs, right? So maybe before, and you see townspeople before they leave the home, they do some sort of warding sigil on themselves to protect themselves from evil that's outside. Maybe there are customs that the people implement when they are, at weddings or festivals or funerals, whatever it may be. Favorite foods and drinks, create unique ones, unique laws or punishments, right? So maybe there's a population decrease in the city and they have money, they have all these things, but they're so remote and they're so, kind of far off that their population's dwindling. And essentially, they've made a new law where when the party comes in, they see them as strangers and almost savior-like, that they're going to bring the rise of their city. So they have a law saying, okay, maybe the party has to marry one of the locals, or they all have to marry locals, or be put to the hangman's noose, right? Something weird like that would be kind of a great story hook, because obviously you're setting this tone of, hey, the players are going to kind of laugh at this most likely, but your party members are expected to marry these villagers, these strangers in a city, and if we don't marry them because of their dwindling population, then they're going to put us to the noose. So it's kind of this weird, you could do a lot of story hooks with the customs and cultures. You can, and with the laws specifically, you can even create a unique law or punishment saying where maybe no magic users are allowed in the city, which now kind of limits the type of classes or the characters that are able to enter into the city. So maybe you have like your generic human fighter with all these different, paladin, party member, wizard, bard, whatever, and only the human fighter is able to enter because they don't use magic. And that city is against magic users for whatever historical reason. Again, that's another story hook. So going back to one of the episodes where we talk about spotlighting, this would 100% spotlight that player as someone who most likely just likes to fight and doesn't get the opportunity to role play and to be the, shining star, so to speak. That would be an amazing opportunity. So as you can see, you can kind of mix and match these things. And then, like I said, festivals and days of mourning, those are things you can add as well. But one thing that I always like to do, and I highly recommend, ask your players to invent a culture or a custom or a quirk from their people, right? Let them be part of that city story. So one thing you could do is that when you create characters, right? When you have the party, or the players rather, create their characters and, form the party, ask them, hey, what city is your character from? What cultural customs do they have? What, kind of lead into that. And then see how the world building or the collaborative world building aspect comes to be. I would be remiss if I did not add this optional layer to this episode, where it is adding historical relevance. I say that because I used to be a historian, and I believe you can obtain deeper immersion, especially in this type of world building, when you layer in history. So 3 things that would be really easy, you don't need to be a historian to do. 1, add some sort of founding myth. It could be true or false, but add some sort of like, there is a myth about the way this city was founded. 2, add a major event that scarred or scared the city, right? And I say it 2 different ways for a specific reason. if it scared the city, there is an emotional, psychological fear, right? So like they are going to make laws to prevent that in the future, so on and so forth. If it scarred the city, then you can interpret that as a physical scarring, right? Like half the city is destroyed because the city that was on a mountain, maybe part of it collapsed. So there are parts of the city that are just ruined. You can even say it's metaphorical. There was a plague and it scared and scarred the city. Scared the city because now there are laws for cleanliness and for ways to prevent the plague. And if a plague occurs, there are secondary and tertiary steps, right? But it scarred the city because the ward where the people were sent who had the plague is completely burnt down. They burned everyone, right? So that's a really scarring event that has occurred. And it leaves the people with this sort of, emotional scar. I know I'm saying that word a lot, but the point is that put in a major event that does that. And then third, one secret that only a few still remember, right? If we're talking about that plague, there's a couple of elders that know how it started and what was done, right? That's a really good insight, or that's a really good story plot hook. So again, I'll repeat it. From a historical perspective, to want or to have deeper immersion, founding myth, a major event that scares or scars the city, and a secret that only a few still remember. So let those pieces of history be discoverable in the game, though. Maybe it's in a mural, maybe it's a temple that's ruined, or even when the tapestries are pulled back, right? Because the tapestries were covering something, you see older murals or older paintings of what actually happened. Or maybe there's a secret room, right? Maybe there's whispers occurring, something of that nature. But you can let those pieces be discoverable in that fashion. And remember, your city doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be playable. You want to start with a purpose, define its layout, populate it with factions, landmarks, and flavor. Then let your players explore it, interact with it, and change it. You need to be open to them changing it. That is the biggest part of it. You lay the foundation, your players mold it. So, if you want a printable PDF with the steps from today's episode, plus district ideas, faction seeds, and map prompts, all that good stuff, you can grab the city building blueprint right now on Patreon. And until next time, folks, I hope that your taverns are rowdy in-game, that the alleyways that you create bring tension and drama, and that the cities you build with your friends are unforgettable. This is Brian the Bearded Nerd signing off. Have a great one, and as always, keep gaming.